Welcome to Cadio's Fall Webinar Series. Thanks so much for joining us today. Today, we are so excited to be listening to a talk by Dr. Catherine Kimber. Dr. Catherine Kimber is a senior lecturer and lead of the Nicotine, Tobacco, and Vaping Research Group at London South Bank University, London, UK. She has over 10 years experience working and conducting research in the tobacco control and nicotine field. Her work includes experimental work to measure puffing topographies, nicotine delivery and absorption, to test public health messaging on harms related to vaping and harm perceptions of vaping, and optimizing smoking cessation interventions to target e-cigarette use. Her prior work in exploring the theory of nicotine titration and compensatory behaviors in vapors suggested that when switching to lower nicotine concentrations, vapors will change their puffing to compensate for the drop in nicotine, thereby potentially increasing their exposure to toxicants. Findings from this research contributed to a new body of knowledge around compensatory behaviors in vapors and advanced further understanding of the health and cost implications of limiting nicotine concentrations in e-liquid. Dr. Kimber, thank you so much for being here with us, and thanks for your talk.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really pleased to be here with you today, and I'm hoping that my presentation will be very helpful in getting people enthusiastic about using the multi-phase optimization strategy in their own work. So the talk that I'm going to give today is basically to provide an example of how the multi-phase optimization strategy can be used in intervention that include e-cigarettes. So the work that I'm going to present today has been funded by the Medical Research Council, and I have no conflict of interest to declare. So as most of you probably know, so the traditional methods that we use to evaluate intervention package are RCTs. So randomized control trials really provide the very robust method of testing the effectiveness of intervention, and more particularly intervention that uses multiple components. But obviously, if you have an intervention that has multiple components, it can be quite challenging to actually disentangle the effects of individual interventions. And more particularly, it will be very difficult to assess the individual effectiveness of each of these intervention component or candidates, but also the interaction between the intervention components can be very difficult to disentangle. Particularly if you have a very complex intervention that may comprise, I don't know, cognitive behavioral therapy, motivational interviewing, or relapse training, for example, it will be very difficult for you to understand whether it was the relapse training that was more effective in that intervention or the motivational interviewing. So in order for you to really understand which intervention component individually, but also the combination of these intervention components was the most effective at producing a good outcome, health outcome, is a very good idea to try and evaluate each of these before actually starting a randomized control trials. So this is where the multi-phase optimization strategy is very useful for doing that. It really helps us understand the individual contribution of that specific intervention component. So I will be using component and candidate interchangeably. So when I say component, it really means intervention candidates. So before packaging that intervention and in order to maximize the therapeutic efficacy of that intervention, it really helps to first evaluate each of these intervention candidate first before actually launching yourself into randomized control trials. That could be very, very costly as well. So first, typically in multi-phase optimization strategy, you do some preparation work. So really you're trying to conceptualize your model, and you do that by looking at the literature, but you can also do that by doing some preparatory work yourself. So developing each of these intervention candidate yourself, and that could be by talking with the people on the ground as well, conducting some PPI work. Then once you've done that, once you've prepared your intervention candidates and you have something that really look like a promising intervention, you can then try and optimize that intervention. So this is where you would use your optimization strategy to try and evaluate this intervention individually, but also together. And only after that, you can then launch yourself into the randomized control trials because you would have developed a good understanding of which one is the most effective. So a little bit of background around the work that I'm going to talk about today. So we did some work, obviously based on the literature. We looked at the literature. We talked to colleagues as well in our field, but we also talked to people on the ground. So we talked to vapers and smokers as well to help us develop that intervention. So we know that, or we knew at the time of developing the project that e-cigarette was the most popular method for quitting smoking. But we also knew that many smokers who tried them really didn't continue using them. They stopped using them. They didn't find them particularly appealing, or they didn't really compete well with the tobacco cigarettes. We also know that there's increasing evidence from the literature, from RCTs, but also some observational studies that show that, nicotine vapes or e-cigarettes are really effective in supporting quit. And they've been found, even including from the Cochrane review, they've been found to be more effective than placebo e-cigarettes, more effective than behavioral support, and more effective than nicotine replacement therapy. So really, they provide a very good way of minimizing harm when it comes to promoting smoking cessation. However, and particularly in Great Britain, at population level, approximately 3 in 5 smokers reported having tried an e-cigarette, but from this pool of people, we also know that many of them stopped using it to continue smoking. We also know that 26% of smokers who have tried vaping would actually 26% of smokers have not tried vaping at all. So clearly to us, it was obvious that there are some factors, some drivers that are actually deterring people from either picking up a vape, an e-cigarette, or just maintaining use of that e-cigarettes, allowing that vapes to actually compete with their tobacco cigarettes. So there are some issues to address here. So from the literature, we know that some of the factors that people have mentioned before is that they do not find e-cigarettes or vapes as satisfactory as they do their tobacco cigarettes. So some people have said that the nicotine delivery is not sufficient, is not satisfactory. It really doesn't match the delivery, the nicotine delivery that they get from their combustible cigarettes. We also know that people struggle to find the right combination of device, nicotine strength, and flavor as well. But we also know that there's been a lot of confusion around vapes in itself. For a smoker, it can be very confusing to hear about the different device types. We have closed devices, so the disposable ones or disposable likes. We also have devices that have a tank that they have to fill in. They may have heard about nicotine salts. They may have heard about freebase nicotine. So we know that there was a lot of confusion for smokers to know where do we start, which device do I use, which device would be most appropriate for me to use, what nicotine strength do I start with, what flavor do I even try? There was a lot of confusion of that. We also knew that from the early research that some smokers would say that they find those tank devices, even though they are quiet, they tend to be associated with greater likelihood of success to make a complete switch away from smoking. We know that these devices can be very scary for some smokers. They are bulky, they are hard to use, they are complex. It gets some like getting used to. So from all of this knowledge, we know that this needs to be looked at, something needs to be done. So any effective intervention will need to actually address this different component. More evidence also suggests that there are a lot of misperceptions around the harms of vaping compared to smoking, with an increased beliefs that in smokers particularly that vaping is equally harmful or even more harmful than smoking. So these misperceptions they have endured for some time, and any interventions again that will help people to transition away from smoking with the help of a vape will need to address these misperceptions if this intervention is to work. So the other factor that we thought about when thinking about a potential intervention was that whilst there was some advice when smokers go to a retail store, that advice was not always there when people wanted to make a purchase online. So people again were a bit lost where to start and how to buy, which device to choose from, which nicotine strength to choose from, which flavor to choose from. And again, these misperceptions around the harms of vaping in relation to smoking needed to be addressed. So what we wanted to do, so we wanted to develop an intervention that really try to tap into all of the different elements that should be there when you develop an interventions, where that intervention will actually include e-cigarettes or vapes. So some of the things that we did, we tried to think about an intervention where people can receive some initial advice on which e-cigarette device to choose, but this will need to be tailored to the smoker's needs. We also thought about which nicotine, giving people advice on which nicotine strength to use. And again, we thought about tailoring advice on which flavor that people can use. And we also thought that in order for that intervention to work, we need to address these misperceptions of harm. And the last element that we thought of including was around some advice to support people along their journeys, their transitional journey. So the first thing that I'm going to address is around what we did to develop the tailored advice on which device to use. So the thing that we did, we used three items that use 5-point Likert scale, and we wanted to address the issues of people's prior knowledge or people's knowledge of the technicalities around the devices. We also wanted to tailor the advice around whether people would like a larger device or a smaller one, and whether people would like to a device that would be able to produce a large volume of aerosol. So we use the items such as the e-cigarette. So we measured people's level of agreements with the following items. So that the e-cigarette must be small, that they would prefer to see a lot of vapor when they exhale, and that the technicalities of the device in itself would likely put them off. And we use the scoring to actually ensure that people who would ascribe to wanting a device that is fairly small, discreet, or wanting a device that didn't require too much knowledge in terms of technical use. These people who would ascribe to that would score higher, and the higher the scores, it will likely be allocated either the pod or something in the middle. People who kind of, for them, the device size didn't matter too much, or that they didn't feel that the technical aspect would not be an issue for them, would score lower, and they would tend to be allocated a larger tank or something more in the middle. Then we tailored advice on nicotine strength, and to do that, we simply use the first item of the Fagerstrom test to measure cigarette dependence. And this is also the items that makes the heaviness of smoking index. And that items is simply ask how soon after waking you smoke your first tobacco cigarettes. And this is the strongest predictor of nicotine dependence in the literature. So the people reporting smoking straight after waking would be advised to use or to choose the higher nicotine strength. People reporting smoking after an hour would be advised to or recommended to choose a lower nicotine strength. Then we tailored advice on nicotine, on which flavor to use. And for that, we simply ask smokers, so do you smoke more menthol cigarette than regular tobacco cigarettes? So if they said yes, they would be recommended to use menthol flavors. If they said no, they would then present it with a second item asking them whether they would like something that feel like smoking or taste like smoking, sorry, or they wanted something completely different. People saying that they would want something completely different would be recommended to choose a food flavor, and that included many base food flavor. And people, smokers, saying that they wanted something that tasted like smoking, they would just simply be recommended to choose a tobacco flavor. Then for the fourth intervention candidate, we simply use the CR UK infographic. So we know that a nicotine fact sheet can really help correct e-cigarette risk perceptions. We know that from the literature. And we also know that these messages conveying reduced risk information around e-cigarettes have been associated with lower odds of smoking. So again, this was just a one-page infographic, so very, very cheap to use. And we also had authorization from CR UK to use their infographic material. Finally, the final intervention candidate that we used, we based our first just the concept of using the text messages. From the literature, we know that text messages are affordable, is scalable, and it provides an effective way of leading to good outcome when it comes to smoking cessation interventions. However, we knew at the time of developing the interventions, we knew that text message interventions was having some promising results in terms of promoting smoking cessation. There were no text message program that included support for people who smoke to quit by switching to vaping. So text messages that really incorporated advice on e-cigarettes did not exist before our work. So we developed a text message support program, and we designed that specifically for these studies with the aim to assist participants with their transition from smoking to vaping. We used prior to the work, we used 2 phases to develop these messages. And these messages really are underpinned by the evidence-based behavior change technique. So the COMBI, so capabilities, opportunities, and motivation, under the notion that if you have the capabilities and the opportunities are there with the right level of motivations, all of this together should really help promote changes in your behavior. So we co-produce these messages with smokers, former smokers, and vapors. So we use 2 different phases. So we first just kind of did a shout out on Twitter and on the social media platform, asking people for what type of text messages, not just any people, but vapors particularly, what types of text messages that they would like to see in order to help people, smokers, transition away from smoking via the use of an e-cigarettes. And that produced around more than almost 200 text messages that we then skimmed through, we refined, and we also obviously removed many of these and we refined them again. And then we added I think we removed about 35% of them. Then we added another 53 messages as well, like the research team. And that led us to having a pool of 95 messages, which were further refined and then mapped against the COM-B approach as well. So that led us to further test these messages in 202 participants online, and that then led to another 78, like kind of like refining the messages. So we use different phases to refine this text message program. And these text message programs were themed. So we felt that we had to cover different areas in order for them to work. So the first theme around smoking cessation support. And one example of that was, for example, your decision to buy an e-cigarette is brilliant, so feel proud of yourself. Remember, if there are tough times, sorry, you have what it takes. Stay strong and stay confident. There were also messages around the practical side of using a vapes. So an example of that, when you add liquid to your e-cigarette for the first time, it's important to let it sit for a few minutes before taking a puff in order to avoid any nasty taste. So all of that really come from the knowledge base from vapors themselves and from the literature and from our expertise, the expertise of the team. We also have messages around relapse preventions, around social identity, and around aspect of the differences between vaping and smoking. So an example of that, vaping is different to smoking. So don't worry if you seem to be vaping more. And this is something that really resonate with me as well, with like further work that I have done when I talk to dual users who are so ever so worried with the fact that they, in their transitional journey, they are worried that they're vaping more, much more than they smoke. So these concerns really needed to be addressed. So this bank of messages have been published for any researcher to use as well. And I've included the link to that in the slides. So I'm happy to share that as well if anyone would be interested in using this. Sorry. So now that we've completed our preparation phase, we are ready to optimize the intervention. So the optimization stage really will allow us to evaluate the performance of each individual component, but also their interaction. And we're going to do that using a multifactorial design so we can rule out any weak or non-performing component in the final optimized intervention. So essentially, we were interested to explore if we provide additional support to smokers purchasing an e-cigarette online, can that increase the likelihood of quitting smoking versus what people are currently doing in practice? So essentially, we want to know what type of intervention components are likely to be the most effective. So the aim of this project really was to determine which of 5 or combination thereof of e-cigarette-orientated intervention components work best to support smoking cessation. And we had in mind to actually retain the statistically significant intervention component in our definitive randomized control trials if the bias factor was more than 2. So we ended up with a factorial design with 5 intervention candidates. The first one, tailored advice on device. The second one, tailored advice on nicotine strength. Tailored advice on flavor, brief information, and text message support. Each intervention with 2 levels, so on and off. So on, so whether the participants were allocated to receive that component or not. And this resulted in 32 permutations. So 32 permutation with the first one, for example, with all of the conditions on, the second one with all of the condition on, but the last one off, and so on. So the primary outcome that we had was 4 weeks self-reported complete abstinence that will be measured at 12 weeks post-randomization. So we had the secondary outcomes as well. So we were interested in finding out whether people smoking abstinence, sorry, at 7-day point prevalence. We were also interested in finding out or in looking at whether people had reduced their smoking from more than 50% or 50% from baseline. And the other secondary outcome that we were also, we thought would be important to look at in order for you to really assess whether your intervention had any chances of actually being complied with. So adherence and compliance with the intervention components is really important as well. So we used the primary analysis where intention to treat analysis. So we are considering any loss to follow-up. We would record that as a failure to quit smoking. The multivariate logistic regressions modeled all three-way, then the two-way interaction, then the mean effect to model the primary outcome, and again on an intention to treat analysis. So we use a staged approach really to explore all three interactions, where in stage one, all mean effects, the two-way and the three interaction were entered into the models. Then there were no significant three interactions. So subsequently in stage two, to give the final estimate of the significant two-way interaction, the significant two-way interaction were entered into the model. And finally, in stage three, with the model reduced to only the significant two-factor interaction, the mean effect of the factors that were not involved in these interactions were entered into the final model. The model was repeated again for the secondary outcome. And we also ran a further model, including all of the participants completed the follow-up survey at the 12 weeks, sorry. So that's the complete case analysis. And we did that on the assumption of data being missing at random. We also wanted to look at, do some more analysis to look at, to exclude those who were not, who did not manage to redeem their vouchers. And all of the models that we ran were adjusted for sociodemographics and smoking characteristic covariates. So that included age, gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, motivation to quit smoking, and their the first tobacco cigarette smoked of the day. Sorry about that. And we used the best factor coefficient. We computed that for all of the mean effect and the interaction as well. And we followed up breaking down all of the significant interactions. So this is our participation flowchart. So I'm just going to talk you through what we did for the study, so how the study really took place. So the study was advertised on social media, on Facebook and Reddit. Participants had a link to our landing page, and participants clicked on the link to enter the survey. So they were pre-screened first, and then they were taken to the survey. And so we had, measured all the socio-demographic items, including history of their smoking and their vaping, their motivation to quit smoking. And we then took them to the tailored advice items where we would use present the item that I presented earlier in the preparation phase section of the presentation. So we collected data between April and October in 2020. So that's a while ago now. And obviously, I will be talking about this later on when I talked about the limitation of the study. So we collected data over a period of 6 months, and we had about 46 participants randomized to one of the 32 permutations at baseline. So there was no differences between the conditions at baseline or at follow-up. So we had a few exclusion. So we excluded people who obviously naturally didn't consent, people who asked for their participation to be withdrawn. We had a fair few violations as well. So people trying to take the survey repeatedly. So we had to post the survey on 2 occasions to add measures to actually stop that from happening. And it's amazing how creative people can be when they're trying to get a £50 voucher to buy an e-cigarette, or when they are bored during the first lockdown that the whole world would have experienced. Yes, so this is the number of participants that we had at baseline and at follow-up. And like I said, there were no differences between numbers of people who completed the follow-up in each of the conditions. So this is what we found. We had the sample was predominantly Caucasian, and we had 61% of the sample was female with a mean age of 39 years old. The majority of or almost half of the sample, reported that they smoked within 5 minutes of waking, which is a fairly high nicotine dependence level. Almost half of the sample reported no previous experience of vaping, and people had a fairly high motivation to quit. We had a fairly decent overall quit rate at 12 weeks. So 19.3% of the sample reported having quit as a result of the intervention. And we had a further 13% of the sample reducing their smoking by 83%, so which was fairly good. Unfortunately, we had no main effect. So none of the 5 e-cigarette orientated intervention components, when delivered alone, significantly increased the odds of reporting complete abstinence from smoking over the previous 4 weeks at the 12 weeks follow-up. So the only significant interaction that we had was between the tailored advice on flavor by text messages. So when advice on flavor and text messages were combined, smokers were more likely to report abstinence over the previous 4 weeks compared to those who received advice on flavor alone or text message alone, or those who received neither. And overall, the quit rate were consistently higher when participants received advice on flavor combined with text message support. And this effect or this combination was consistently observed across all of the outcomes. And there were no other 2 or 3 interactions or no main effect at all. So we conducted some sensitivity analysis. So after we removed 12 participants who did not redeem their vouchers, the pattern of the results remains similar, with advice on flavor by text message, the only significant interaction for all of the outcomes, the primary or secondary outcomes. And for the complete case analysis, the text messages interacted with flavor to increase the odds of quitting when both components were delivered together. So again, when the advice on flavor delivered alone, or when the text message was delivered alone, again, this was slightly inferior to when the advice on flavor was combined with the text messages program. And again, the same pattern was observed for when looking at the secondary outcome of smoking reduction, sorry. But this, sorry, 1 second. Yes, so there was no significant mean effect still. So the findings should really be taken in a context of the data collection period, which was at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, and that spanned through the first lockdown. And obviously, we knew that we all remember at this time, so many workers were being furloughed, so people were staying at home. All the shops were closed, and there was at the time on social media a narrative about, around quit for COVID. So perhaps we need to take into account that the finding may have been slightly influenced by people's increased motivation, perhaps to quit smoking. But we also know that, again, whilst there was perhaps increased motivation to quit smoking, and this might be due perhaps to the heightened concern and stress or anxiety around the fact that there was a respiratory disease going on that people were scared of catching. Likewise, that may have also influenced the results the other way around, because it may be the case that people were bored. And obviously, we know that smokers at times where they experience high level of stress and anxiety, that also means that their smoking might increase, because finding that smoking might help alleviate some of the stress and anxiety. So again, it's difficult for us to establish whether, you know, um, collecting data at this period may have actually play a part in helping people to actually increase their motivation to quit, and getting more people into the study and getting them more motivated to actually quit versus the result of the intervention in itself. Or it could be the case that actually that didn't help us, because people, if anything, were so stressful that they find it really hard to stop or reduce their smoking in times of stress. Yeah. We also had many issues around violations. So many bots and many people trying to take the survey repeatedly. So we had to take a few measures, adding measures to our survey to actually try to combat that issue. Some of the limitation of the study as well was that we did not have any biomarkers to verify abstinence, and the short follow-up duration means that it's difficult to extrapolate from the success really of the intervention long term. We only measured the intervention at 12 weeks follow-up. And there was a fairly high attrition rate as well. We did actually give a reward at follow-up, but that reward was significantly lower than the reward that people were given at the start of the study. So at follow-up, people were paid just a £10 vouchers versus the £50 that they were given at the start of the survey. So this is something for you to really bear in mind when you develop your interventions. There is a balance to exercise there in terms of how you can stagger the intervention in a more balanced way throughout the intervention without really without, how do you say that, overshadowing your intervention. So you've got to make sure that the intervention is the intervention, and the incentive that is in place is not actually, overshadowing that intervention and not playing a part in actually getting people to stop smoking, so that you can delineate that effect. We had good compliance of all of the intervention candidates. However, for the brief information uh, intervention candidate, we had very, very low compliance. The majority of the participants were allocated to receive the brief information did admit to us that they did not read it. And I already mentioned the issues around the bots. So to conclude, I think I'm doing well, with time anyway. To conclude, combining the intervention components seemed to work better than any intervention component alone to increase quit rates at 12 weeks. And using a factorial design guided by the multi-phase optimization strategy to screen the multiple intervention components that could be delivered alone to support smokers to use e-cigarette with smoking, our findings suggest that tailored advice on flavor combined with text message support is a promising intervention combination to promote smoking cessation. But that really warrants further evaluation in an RCT, and this time, if the funding allow, with biochemically verified abstinence and longer term outcomes. So these findings really highlight the importance of evaluating individual intervention component, so the main effect of them, each of these components, but also the interaction of this component before embarking into an RCT to maximize the chances of developing an effective and cost-effective intervention package. So nevertheless, again, future research is needed in that area. So the interaction that we saw between text message and advice on flavor, for us to replicate these findings, we need to make sure that we develop future an intervention to actually try and see if that would be replicable actually. Obviously, because our study was collected in a period that was atypical as well. So again, we need to make sure that we repeat the project. And just to finish here, so I'd like to thank the research team, all my colleagues and our funders, our participants, and our PPI groups as well. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Kimber. So interesting. Um, to our attendees, I encourage you, if you have a question, you can put it in the chat. You can send it to me directly. You can turn on your camera and join the conversation. You can raise your hand, whether literally or through the little Zoom tool, whatever you want to do. But I'll kick off this question period with one that Linda put in the chat. Is getting people to quit combustible tobacco by switching to vaping controversial at all in the UK? It's a controversial idea here in the US.
That's a very good question. So it is, I would say, and I know that the landscape in the US is very complex, and it's made complex by the history of youth vaping and all other actors that perhaps I should not mention. But in the UK, this is not controversial at all. So we have various schemes that are supported by our government. All our interventions and the literature, or actually all schemes, are based on evidence that e-cigarettes actually are helpful in promoting smoking cessation. But there is a sense as well, and people do agree that, you've got to make sure that whatever you do, you are using e-cigarette as a harm reduction tool. So any intervention that are developed, any schemes that are advertised, such as the swap to stop scheme, which is supported by the NHS here, and all smoking cessation in stop smoking services in the UK, sorry, are have in mind that we are to encourage smokers to switch to a less harmful nicotine delivery product, but we do not actually encourage uptake or use in non-smokers, so people who've never smoked, or young people as well. So yeah, good questions. Yeah. Did I answer that
Great.
okay?
Yeah, very interesting.
So what are
Um,
your thoughts, Linda?
Yeah, no, I'm completely on board with the idea of harm reduction, but harm reduction itself is a controversial idea in the U.S. In all kinds of domains. In particular, with tobacco, there's a lot of people who believe that people just simply should not be using nicotine products, period. And what we need to be doing is just getting people off nicotine, and therefore it doesn't make sense to have kind of a bridge, or substitute for a while. To me, that doesn't make, I mean, it doesn't make that much sense. I mean, I'm actually a great believer in harm reduction, and I personally have suggested it. A number of people I know in my life have said, oh, my grandfather smokes and I wish he would stop. And I've often said, well, one thing you could do is suggest vaping. It's not as harmful as
Yeah.
combustible tobacco, but um, the I think a lot of my colleagues in the Society for Research on Nicotine and Tobacco in the US would not necessarily agree with that. And then
Yes,
there's been some preliminary evidence. I saw a poster about this at SRNT, not where we saw each other in Scotland. It was the one in New Orleans more recently, where dual use, there's some preliminary evidence that dual use is potentially very harmful. So, I mean, if that's the case, that would, you know,
Yeah,
maybe
yeah, I know.
suggest that it's not a great idea.
It sounds very punitive to me to actually not trying to understand the behavior first. And we know how difficult it is for people to just to quit like that, like cold turkey, isn't it? So I think it's important to be supportive and, to be compassionate about the people that we're trying to help. And the evidence is there to show that it is less harmful. And although dual use may be problematic, but dual use is a transition. It is a journey. So for people to transition away from smoking, they first need to actually transition, isn't it? So the people that I talk to, some smokers who are trying to actually transition, there are concerns around using both is more driven by the negative stories that people keep hearing about other people's concerns that you should not do it. And I think if we actually have more support to understand that it is a transition and we need to do more to allow vaping product to compete with tobacco combustible cigarettes, that will actually be much more effective way to support, to actually embrace the harm reduction approach and support smoking cessation. So I think Jennifer has a question.
Yeah, hi, thank you. So yeah, that's a whole world of conversation about the switching. But and that's another intervention, right? Helping people through that transition period. So I guess my question was about something else. It was about since you were doing so much remotely and with all the different devices and flavors and stuff, did you get any sense of contamination across the components where, someone who's assigned a flavor might have been, or to no flavor,
That's a
even though
very
that
good
was
question.
like, what did you find there, based on what they were actually doing in their real life?
So this is difficult for us to assess, right? Because we did not find any main effect
Yeah.
of any of the component, but we did find that interaction, which was very surprising to us, because we were expecting to really find an interaction between the device type, sorry, the nicotine strength, and we did not see that interaction there, and we believe that it might be to do with the refinement of the tailoring of that item, isn't it? Because we did it in a very simplistic way that was, in a way, obviously, where costs are involved, and anything that you try to do to refine a bit more will render the intervention more costly, but obviously adding more factors into the intervention to make it more complex to interpret the results, right? But I think some of the things that we thought perhaps is that some nicotine strength would not necessarily be compatible with certain devices. So we know, for example, that the pods, for example, the pod device that we recommended to use would have not been a good idea. Or actually, the opposite. The tank devices, so this large one where you can adjust the wattage, would have not been necessarily compatible with a very high strength if the person does not have the knowledge that they need to lower down the wattage. So there's like so many different elements that come into play. So the device types, the knowledge of how to use it, the nicotine strength, whether it is compatible or not with the device. And when it comes to also looking at what was I going to say? The liquid as well that you use, isn't it? So there's like free-base liquid with the vegetable glycerin and propylene glycol. And then you have people using nicotine salts, which are widely available now. So all of these different elements, I think it's important that any future interventions really take all of this into account and really think very carefully of when developing each of these intervention candidates very carefully before packaging them together. So Yeah, but we did not, we were not able to really make the assessment of whether one kind of influence or kind of undermined the other in terms of the intervention component. It's a good question,
Yeah, no,
Jennifer.
that's interesting. Well, I guess a follow-up on that is, I mean, all you can really do is ask people, did you have the opportunity to ask people if they were using different kinds of e-cigarettes in their, like, separate from the study? Like if they were trying e-cigarettes
So,
on their own in addition to whatever they were assigned to in the study?
no, we did not, and I wish we'd done that.
Yeah, I mean, people might
What
not
we
have
did,
told
we
you the
followed
truth,
up.
but
Yeah, we followed the people about the text messages, actually, just trying to understand uh, how useful they were, and even practical side of things, looking at were there too many, were they annoying, the frequency of it, was it okay? So future intervention, we can look at how you can readjust that. Yeah, but that's a good question, Jennifer. Thank you for that.
yeah, no, it's really complicated what you were doing there. So
Yeah,
there's a lot to think about.
yeah.
Very interesting.
Back to harm reduction and the harm reduction conversation for a moment. That conversation has prompted some follow-ups in the chat. In your study, Catherine, did you analyze smoking reduction versus abstinence? Did you think about looking at that? And also, were you assessing dual use and the use of e-cigarettes and more traditional combustible cigarettes in your study specifically?
No, we did not. So we measured smoking reduction, and we were particularly interested in measuring 50% of smoking reduction or more. So we did not measure, for example, the levels of use versus tobacco cigarettes smoked per day. So we did not compare that. But again, an interesting questions as well. And I think that comes from the notion of the concerns around dual use, right? So whether when transitioning, whether people are transitioning in a way where they actually drop their tobacco cigarettes considerably versus vaping much more. And I think the data in itself, perhaps there's a small pool of people where we found the first 13% of smokers reduce, they did not quit, but they've reduced their smoking considerably. So these people reporting 83% more smoking reduction. So that would indicate to me that there's a large substitution of tobacco cigarettes there for vaping. And in studies, not in this project specifically, but in other projects that I've been involved in, we do see the first 2 weeks of use, we do see a big drop in terms of the substitution for the tobacco cigarettes for vaping. But again, that may be with the high motivations at the start, perhaps as well. And we need more research to try and understand whether this carries on or whether there is a kind of fatigue and people would kind of like go back to their old habit of this doesn't really work for me, I'm just going to go back to smoking. Yeah,
Right.
but it is a real fight for some people, and I think it is a shame where there is a lack of consensus, it feels like, in terms of the tobacco harm reduction approach. And I think there are more buy-in in really on this, like basing our views and or concerns on the evidence, as opposed to kind of thinking about the concerns really that we may have, because it really doesn't agree with the fact that we're just promoting, it feels like we're promoting nicotine use as opposed to really trying to get people off all drugs altogether.
Yeah, there's another question in the chat that's a follow-up to that point and is agreeing with the idea that this cold turkey approach is not compassionate. What do you think has helped the UK maintain public trust in its harm reduction messaging around vaping?
I think our researchers are quite vocal. We do work a
Mm.
lot with policymakers, and where we do that, the policymakers have been quite good at looking at the evidence. So we have now actually a call for evidence from the government to asking us researchers what should we do with this? How do we regulate? How do we go forward with the regulations of vapes? I think it is important for government to understand that you base your policies on the evidence by asking the people on the ground. And a lot of the research that we do, increasingly, we do a lot of work around PPI as well. So we do listen to the people who are affected by the behavior in itself. And this doesn't drive exactly all of our research questions, but what we do, we actually take that into account. So although not everything that would be said would have shaped the project that we do, but we do let that surely inform our interventions. And if you have an interventions where you've taken into account the people's behaviors, what they do, but what they know work, what they know would not work, the language that they use as well. So for you to actually devise your measures, so the way you're going to, when you do your interventions and you do a whole lot of measures, there's a certain language that you've got to make sure that you get right. So without speaking with the people on the ground, you would not necessarily know what language to use in order to make sure that the measures that you've used are really valid and effective in measuring what you intend to measure.
Mm-hmm. So interesting. Well, thank you once more for your really fascinating presentation and this conversation. I see that we're about at time, so thank you everybody for being here with us today, and we hope to see you all again very soon.
My pleasure, and I hope to come back.
Yes, definitely.
Thank you for inviting me
Definitely.
again,
Thank
Julian and
you.
Linda. It was great.